I'm Asana, and today I'm taking you on a trip to the Scottish borders. I've been to Scotland a few times, and I think as a teenager I passed through the Scottish borders on a family holiday, but I was so excited that this year I was invited by the Scotland Starts Here campaign to come explore the gorgeous literary locations and history in the Scottish borders. I started out this trip pretty much with zero knowledge besides a big interest in history, and on this trip we heard everything about border reivers, battles, Vikings, abbeys, and lots more. I'm obviously not an expert, but I was furiously typing away on my notes app as we were meeting locals and being shown around by some incredible tour guides, and I'm very excited to share it all with you. So first of all, let's quickly put us on the map. We took the train from London to Edinburgh, which I've done a few times. If you do take that train, try to sit on the right side of the train because you will get the most beautiful coastal view. Then we transferred at Edinburgh Waverley, which is also the namesake of the book I was reading. More on that later. We actually had just enough time to leave the station and have a quick peek at the Scott Monument. Then we got on another train going south. It took about an hour. We arrived at Tweedbank, where we met our host and guide extraordinaire, Sarah, and we started exploring from there. This is where we are on the map. This area is called the Scottish Borders, and actually with our itinerary we managed to get across quite a lot of it. During this trip we definitely found out that a lot of the history is defined by its geographical positioning, which is the English and Scottish border. Okay, I think it's time for a small literary introduction. Two of the biggest literary players in the Scottish borders were Sir Walter Scott and James Hogg. And we're going to start with Sir Walter Scott. Sir Walter Scott was born in 1771 in Edinburgh, but when he was young he had polio and he was sent to the Scottish borders to live with some of his relatives, and they lived at Sandyknoe Farm, which was next to the ruins of Smailham Tower, which had been a family residence before. He studied classics at Edinburgh, and then he also studied law, and he became involved in the literary circles there. Then he also became involved in politics and was part of lots of societies and held lots of different titles. So in the end he was a poet, a novelist, playwright, and a historian. And he was also the deputy sheriff in Selkirk, and we visited his old courthouse. He wrote 27 novels and only one of them was not historical. He also was involved in finding the Scottish crown jewels, and in Edinburgh he has the Scott Monument named after him, and Edinburgh Waverley Station that we travelled through was named after his novel Waverley. So that is the quick rundown of Sir Walter Scott. So he built this incredible home called Abbotsford. We did the full tour there with a tour guide and it was incredible. So we've just come out of Abbotsford, which you can see behind me, which is the old home of Sir Walter Scott. The moment you step into that first room, like, I was not ready for the incredible collection that he has there, and they were saying he loved to host. There were a lot of talking points in there. We went into his gorgeous library, I think one of my favorites I've ever seen. We're now in the gardens. Our tour guide Claudia was incredible. We also did an audio tour. I accidentally did the kids audio tour, which is run by his old dog and a cat, which I actually thought was hilarious and loved doing. One of my favorite things that we've been told about the building is how many pieces were gathered from basically all over the place. Old buildings that were being taken down and other places where Sir Walter Scott was able to gather them, and he basically put them, you know, all over the outside and the inside of the house. It's absolutely massive here. You can also stay here if you want to, and I think we're gonna go and have a look at the gardens now. Okay, so I have absolutely no historical facts to give you about this garden, except that it's like a fairy tale garden. It's so beautiful. You've got, where is it? You've got the gorgeous home in the background. It's incredible. You have to be here to experience it. There's bees everywhere. There's beautiful flowers everywhere. I think we might have like 15 minutes to do a bit of sketching. If not, I'm just gonna take a photo and take that home and then draw it home. Sir Walter Scott absolutely loved dogs, and he had a deerhound called Maida, and Maida is actually buried right in front of the house under her own statue. And apparently Sir Walter Scott used that statue as like a step to get onto his horse after it was placed there. Doing the tour of Abbotsford and learning about him this way, I think really just made him seem more human. And I think what was so interesting to learn was like, what were his passions? What was he excited about? What were his little quirks? Now, I'm aware that I've just given you an introduction to Sir Walter Scott, but a few weeks ago I was feeling woefully unprepared. So I did what any person would do, and I went book shopping. I have received a parcel in the mail with some of the books that I'll be bringing on this trip. I don't know how many I'll be able to bring. I don't know whether I can bring a little suitcase or not. First of all, we have The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. This title sounded very familiar. In case you don't know, I studied English lit, well, technically English language and culture, but it included a lot of English literature in the Netherlands. And I maybe thought that this was one that had been on my literature list or I'd come across because the title sounded so familiar. But then I had a little look and I don't think I've, ever owned this or read any of it before. But it seems to be quite dark and gothic, which I'm into. And I also really like these Penguin Classics editions because their intros are usually quite good. I used to not read intros. Now, because obviously it's been a long time since university, it feels like fun self-study and exploration. Then I also wanted to get some Sir Walter Scott, and I ended up picking Waverley, which I hadn't heard about before. And I think a good tip in general, like when you're interested in reading more classics, is to go with classics that actually sound interesting to you. So I looked through the selection of books that were available by Sir Walter Scott, and this is one that jumped out at me, so that's the one I went for. It was an international bestseller, came out in 1814, and then finally I bought one of the very short introduction guides. I recently bought one about like the Gothic movement and Gothic literature, and because some of these Scottish authors were also involved with like the Romantic poets and kind of moved in the same circles, and it's one of my favorite topics that I studied at uni, I thought let's get back to basics and get this introduction to just do a little refresher. I will have a look at some other books as well, but for now I've got these. Hello, welcome to today's lesson of Classics Are Scary. Or are they? So these are the two fiction books that I brought on my trip, and so I want to give you a quick pitch for each of them and talk about how I tackled them myself. So first of all, Waverley by Sir Walter Scott. I love this cover. Is it entirely representative of the book? Maybe not, but it's very pretty. This was published anonymously in 1814, but it takes place in 1745, so it is a historical novel. I think I've already mentioned this at some point in this video, but if I haven't yet, it's like one of the first and most influential historical novels in the West. It's about a young Englishman who joins the army, goes to Scotland, then goes on leave to visit family. He gets involved in politics, uprising. He starts in like the lowlands of Scotland, then goes to the Highlands. He's accused of treason. He falls in love more than once. The introduction of this book is quite funny because both the sort of first page that describes Sir Walter Scott and then the intro to the text and then the intro to the book are all basically saying this is the best thing ever. It says it changed forever the way people constructed their personal and national identities. And then the intro says it has a strong claim to be the most influential work in the modern history of the novel. And then when they talk about the text, they're very much explaining like this version of the text is the best version ever. In the introduction, there's also a quote by Jane Austen as she comments on Waverley. She says, Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It is not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet and should not be taking the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not like him and I do not mean to like Waverley if I can help it, but I fear I must. And apparently, which I didn't catch at the time that I was reading it, in Persuasion, Anne and Captain Benwick are comparing Lord Byron and Sir Walter Scott in a discussion they're having. For this book, I started reading the introduction on the trip in the physical book, but I actually switched to the audiobook later. And I thought, especially because the first chapters are quite heavy and maybe a bit more difficult to get through, I thought this was a really good way of getting into it, and especially because it is like a historical adventure. It's nice to listen to. There are quite a lot of politics that I think initially, if you're trying to get to the story, you can kind of absorb as much as you can, and then you can go back or like look up additional sources and find out a bit more. Hilariously, the narrator, who is very present in this story, does actually apologize to his current audience, because the audience at the time was also reading it as a historical novel, so might not have known some of the finer details. And he says something along the lines of, "Don't worry, the carriage that I'm taking you in will soon have a better view, so like bear with me." There's a lot of humor in it too, especially in like certain kinds of characters that are maybe, you know, slightly exaggerated. If you've read some Austen or some Shakespeare, those are things that will be familiar to you. While reading this book and at the same time getting to know the author and being in the location, it was absolutely wonderful. I don't think this was the closest to my personal taste. It was definitely this one, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. Now, as much as I enjoyed the introduction to Waverley, I did not enjoy this introduction. I felt like it was an academic talking to their peers, but I feel like that introduction is supposed to guide you into it, make you enthusiastic about the book, give you context. Interestingly, the writing of the introduction was not accessible, but the actual text itself really is. This one was definitely not as recognized or celebrated at the time that it came out. It was published in 1824, and the introduction says it wasn't a big success, but it became more widely read in the 1940s and is now generally considered his masterpiece. This is the story of two brothers. One of them is the heir of the family, the other one is born out of adultery. He is raised separately with very different beliefs. Some of it may involve him thinking that's okay for him to kill people that he believes are already doomed. So I feel like Waverley has more of a political and cultural focus, and this definitely has a focus on religion and morals. The first half of the story is told by a narrator who doesn't have all the ins and outs of the story. Very often in Gothic books that I've read, you get the second or third hand experience of something that's happened, and then the second part is like a retelling of the true story from the point of view of the sinner. I think if you like The Picture of Dorian Gray or Jekyll and Hyde, then this is a great one for you. And I wrote that down and then found out that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde definitely took some inspiration from this one. I love following the thread of inspiration through classics. I've kind of been doing it with vampire novels over the last year. There are brawls, there is murder, maybe some possession, court cases. It feels a bit culty as well. I had a goal this year to read more Gothic classics, and they're just totally the one for me. Once again, it's been confirmed. I think for me as well, like as much context as I can add to a classic just makes it so much more enjoyable. And on that note, we will be visiting a graveyard later in this video. But first I'm going to tell you about the Border Ballads. We first got introduced to the Border Ballads at Smailham Tower. You can see it from far away. As we were driving around, we kept seeing it on the horizon, and it is a 15th century peel tower, and these structures were very helpful if you had to be on the lookout for border reivers. You know, with the view, you could get a bit of a head start to prepare for a raid. But the special connection with Smailham Tower is that Sir Walter Scott's grandparents lived and worked here, and when he was young, Sir Walter Scott came here, and this is when he first found out about the Border Ballads from his aunt and his grandmother. In the area there was an oral storytelling tradition because people moved around a lot, and you know, there were fires where people would lose all their belongings, so obviously it made sense to pass on stories in this way. And I wish I could play you the audio guide that we listened to as we walked through the exhibition that's on in Smailham Tower. There were these small costumed figures that were made by Anne Carrick, who is a borders artist, and they were on display in all these like different scenarios, each of them representing a different border ballad, and then you could, you know, press the number for the matching story and listen to the border ballad being sung as you walked around. It was really interesting to see like what kind of stories they were. So a lot of them were about raids and battles, but there were also a lot with like supernatural themes, like fairy abductions, and the wind was roaring around the tower, and it was like the perfect setting for it. James Hogg, who I mentioned earlier, was a shepherd in the Ettrick Valley when he met Sir Walter Scott. They became lifelong friends, and James Hogg's mother was actually also a source for a lot of the border ballads, which Sir Walter Scott then wrote down to preserve them. Obviously, not everyone agreed with that. And if this is something that you're interested in, you can actually go to Project Gutenberg, which I'll link in the description, and you can read Scott's minstrelsy of the border ballads. There's different volumes, and all the border ballads also come with kind of an introduction and an explanation, so it gives you a bit more of the backstory, which is great. I'm definitely going to go in and try and find some of the stories I listened to with that audio guide and also read some new ones. Sometimes it kind of blows my mind to think about how famous authors used to hang out together. And to show you some examples of where they did that, we're going to the Yarrow and Ettrick Valley and St. Mary's Loch. At this gorgeous location at the edge of the loch, there is an inn called Tibby Shiels, named after the woman who used to run it. Okay, so this is the famous Tibby Shiels, where Wordsworth and James Hogg and lots of the literary greats just used to hang out together. So they've recently done this up. You can visit. They've got beautiful portraits and quotes inside. You're right by the loch. You know, you can feel the inspiration hanging in the air. Let me turn around so you can see the view on the other side. Being there, knowing that all these authors met there, talked together, saw the beauty of nature there and were inspired by it, it massively brought things to life, I think. At St. Mary's Loch, we also met Mark Nicol, who is a local historian and tour guide. He loves tracking down locations related to history, and we met at the James Hogg statue, which overlooks St. Mary's Loch. We climbed up to this beautiful old kirkyard with a gorgeous view, but we also went to a slightly more hidden grave that is related to one of the border ballads called The Lament of the Border Widow. In the border ballad, you find out that her husband was a border freebooter who was executed, and this is the grave that is related to it. So I feel like you can't get any more closer to the local stories than something like this. Then we had a gorgeous lunch at the Gordon Arms, which is really close to St. Mary's Loch as well in the Yarrow Valley. This has been beautifully done up and serves like local produce. They kind of list exactly where they get everything from. We had so many lovely different dishes at different restaurants where this was the case as well. And this restaurant had a plaque saying this is the place where Hogg and Scott sort of met up for the very last time and parted ways. You can stay there as well, and again, just like a wonderful piece of history. Next up, we went to another graveyard. We drove to Ettrick Kirk to find his grave. We had this gorgeous route through the valley. Can't quite explain what it feels like to like stand next to someone's grave with like the piece of literature that they wrote in your hands. It was very atmospheric and rainy and mossy and just a gorgeous place. Last time I went to the Lake District, I bought a poetry collection by William Wordsworth, selected by Seamus Heaney, and I had a quick look at this after my trip and realized there is a poem dedicated to James Hogg by William Wordsworth upon the death of James Hogg. When first descending from the moorlands, I saw the stream of Yarrow glide. Along a bare and open valley, the Ettrick shepherd was my guide.
It was beautifully done. Hello.
trip is all about Scotland's Year of Stories, which is this year, so it's very much a literary tour. And today we're going to an absolutely gorgeous bookshop here in the Scottish borders. When I went to look at their Instagram, I realized I think I've seen a talk by the owner before, like maybe at a book conference I went to or something like that, because it all sounded and looked very familiar. Obviously, I've never had the chance to visit, so I'm very excited. So we had a tour of the deli and the shop and the bookshop. We just had lunch at the cafe. We're refreshed, we've browsed books. We're ready to go to the next adventure. The Great Tapestry of Scotland, which is based in Galashiels, is one that you absolutely cannot miss. It depicts 420 million years of Scottish history, and it was created by 1,000 stitchers from all across Scotland. Hearing the stories, it was an incredible collaborative effort, and the stitchers were given so much freedom to add personal and local touches, which the guides will be more than happy to tell you about. And you can definitely spend a good few hours here. In Selkirk, we got the full Meet the Locals tour, and we popped into a ton of wonderful shops, including Selkirk Distillers for gin tasting. We also went to the general store that tries to repair anything that people bring in, which was incredible. And we dropped by the local bookshop, the Forest Bookstore. In Selkirk, we also visited Sir Walter Scott's courtroom in a building that dates back to 1804. So Scott was the sheriff of Selkirkshire, and he worked there until his death in 1832. The courtroom currently houses a small exhibition, which I think is a great intro to Scott's life. We also visited the Haining, which is a country house that was left to the people of Selkirkshire. It's a gorgeous place to go for a walk, as locals often do, and it is absolutely stunning. You can also stay here if you want to. And this is the statue of Old Ginger, who was born at the Haining and is the father of the local dog breed, the Dandy Dinmont. From our second day in the south of Scotland. I'm currently sitting by myself, it's quite early, in the garden of the Philipburn Hotel in Selkirk. We got the full tour of Selkirk yesterday. When I stay somewhere, whether it's in a hotel or in a town, I always like to get up early, like just before breakfast, and have a little look around. We're actually staying at different accommodation each night, and we're traveling around quite a bit, but in the same area. The sun's coming out. I'm also really enjoying the short introduction guide to romanticism. I skipped straight to the poetry section, but that's been really fun to kind of brush up on. Those introduction guides, I hadn't read much of them before. You kind of experience them as if it's like a really interesting 2-hour lecture, which I think is great. There's a little pheasant behind me, and that's why it's worth going out early in the morning. We're gonna go have breakfast, pack our bags, hop in the car and go to the next destination.
That's toffee.
Good morning, it is Sunday. We have another gorgeous schedule for today. We're currently staying in a B&B just outside of Kelso with Angela, who has been so welcoming. She's making a vegan breakfast this morning, which I'm so excited to try. The dinner last night was so good. It was so tasty. It was really special. Like every dish just had like a nice twist to it. I think we have quite a big drive this morning, but we are supposed to be going to, I think it's a pub where a lot of the Romantic poets and Sir Walter Scott used to meet up. You can also visit the Tremontium Museum, which is all about the Roman fort that was placed just east of Melrose, and it was the largest Roman fort north of Hadrian's Wall. Melrose is a lovely and picturesque town, and you'll immediately spot the Melrose Abbey ruins when you drive through it. We are currently in Melrose, and we are at the beautiful ruins of the Abbey here. And the rules are, if there are Abbey ruins, we have to go see them. We just have to. So I hope you enjoyed my tour of the Scottish borders. I'm also creating a full blog post around this trip with lots of practical tips and information on like places to visit, to stay at, and to eat. I hope sharing some of this allowed you to kind of dream away and maybe think about a possible future trip. There is so much more to explore. Like, even as I was preparing this video and looking at the map, I was just finding lots of other locations I would love to visit as well. So hopefully we get to come back one day. I want to say a huge thanks to Sarah, who was such an incredible guide. We were in her car for 4 days chatting away. She took us everywhere, took us under her wing, and was absolutely wonderful and so knowledgeable. And also a huge thanks to Jer for being my travel partner in crime and shooting some beautiful footage and photos on the trip. And obviously thanks to the South of Scotland Destination Alliance for hosting us. All right, I hope you enjoyed watching, and I'll talk to you soon. Doei!